In my last video, I reviewed 5 very popular books from a very popular author, and that has now become my most popular video. I'm kind of shocked it reached so many people, but it makes sense because the video was about a topic that general audiences are familiar with and that is very relevant right now. So for my next trick, I'm going to completely change lanes and go back to reviewing the TV show Moominvalley. You know, the children's show based on books from the 40s that isn't even available in America. I've already reviewed seasons 1, 2, and 3 here on my channel, and the 4th and final season was released in October of last year. So, in the spirit of tradition, and because today is the 6th anniversary of the show's premiere, I'm going to review the 4th season and give my thoughts on the show as a whole, and I have a lot of them. I already shared some of those thoughts in my reaction to the season shortly after it premiered, but in this review, I'll be expanding on a lot of those points and actually thinking about what I say before I say it. Of course, Moominvalley is just one of many adaptations of the original Moomin books, so as with my other reviews, I won't be comparing this series to the ones before it, I'll only be evaluating it on its own merit. I'll start by covering the season in general, then review each episode and give it a score out of 10, which I'll then average out to get the final rating for the final season. I'm operating on the assumption that you've already seen the season, so this video will be chock full of spoilers, and honestly it probably won't make much sense if you're not at least a little familiar with the show. The season in general. Sadly, this is indeed the final season of the show. There is apparently a movie in the works, but I'm a Gorillaz fan, so I've learned not to get my hopes up with this sort of thing. The animation this season was good, probably the best it's been, although there are moments where it looks a little off, and I still don't know how I feel about the 3D designs. The score is great, as always. It was recently released on streaming, and I think listening to it on its own has made me appreciate it so much more. This season is generally much more similar to the 3rd than it is to the first 2. I think this is pretty interesting because it kind of splits the show into 2 even halves. The first 2 seasons have an original soundtrack in addition to the score, and the last 2 do not. And because there is no soundtrack, I have once again provided a list of artists I would have liked to see contributions from. Mitski, for the same reasons as before. Do you know how many people became Moomin fans because of that Strawberry Blonde animatic? A song in the style of her newest album, like The Frost or When Memories Snow, would have been perfect for a wintertime scene. Clairo and Norah Jones might have been cool too, but I think all 3 of these women are way too famous. Also, I can't think of anyone else. Travis Scott, Pearl Jam, Benny and the Jets, who gives a shit? Oh, and Angel Valentine. I think she would have really liked the opportunity. The cast was also shuffled around a bit before the 3rd season and then stayed the same for the 4th, so each half of the show has a slightly different cast. And unfortunately, before the release of the 4th season, Chance Perdomo, who voiced Snork, tragically passed away. He and his characters still have a large role in the season, and the first episode is dedicated to his memory. In my opinion, this situation was handled in the best and most respectful way possible. I've said before that I absolutely adore Snork in this adaptation, and the character and the show would not have been the same without Chance Perdomo. Episode 1, Ringmaster Brisk. This season does not start off strong. The first thing I noticed about this episode was how thematically similar it was to The Golden Tale, an episode from season 1. Both episodes are about Moomin Troll wanting to prove himself after Moomin Papa doubts him. I just don't think it was necessary to repeat that storyline because it's something we've seen happen multiple times in the show by now. I also frankly don't care about Brisk or pretty much anything that happens at the circus. What I did enjoy was the B plot, where Little Mai befriends a crocodile. And technically, Little Mai making a little animal friend is also something that already happened in season 3, so this episode in general just feels like a rehash. This episode was kind of a weird start to the season. I rate Ringmaster Brisk a 4 out of 10. Episode 2, Moomins and the Railway. In the same way Ringmaster Brisk was kind of a worse version of The Golden Tale, Moomins and the Railway is kind of a worse version of Snufkin and the Park Keeper. Both episodes are about Snufkin trying to stop some sort of threat to the valley and its natural environment. This time, it's a railway cutting straight through the middle of the valley. And Moomin Papa actually ends up on the side of the railway helping things progress. I hate this version of Moomin Papa. I find him to be so selfish and he never grows out of that. That's all he ever gets to be and it gets so old. That being said, I love Matt Berry's performance and I also think he was the perfect choice to succeed Dennis Hopper for that live performance of fire coming out of the monkey's head back in 2020. You have no idea how excited I was when I first saw it. I was like,
Moomin Papa! What? Moomin Papa!
And speaking of Snufkin, again, this is his first appearance of the season and the only Snufkin-centric episode. It's also the first time we see him interacting with Moomintroll. This episode is such a clear sign of the absolute backseat that these characters in their relationship were about to take. Everything that had developed between them in the last 3 seasons is completely gone and it feels like such a major step back. I rate Moomins in the Railway a 5 out of 10. Episode 3, Sniff's Cave. You may have noticed by now that I'm not recapping these episodes in nearly as much detail as I did in previous reviews, and that's because I kind of already went over them in my reaction video, but it's also because I kind of don't care, and I don't think you do either. I still don't know how to feel about Sniff in this adaptation. At his best, he reminds me a lot of Duck Guy from Don't Hug Me I'm Scared, specifically the TV series, and that is very high praise. However, when Sniff is at his worst, which is most of the time, I find this version of him to be so annoying, especially because he has way more screen time this season than he deserves. He's so thoroughly unlikable, and it's so hard to root for or sympathize with him as a result. Because this is the final season of the show, this episode serves as kind of a farewell and a tying up of loose ends for this character, and I can appreciate that. There are going to be a lot of episodes like this, including the very next one, and some of them work, and some of them don't. Sniff's Cave, in my opinion, is one of the ones that don't. I rate Sniff's Cave a 3 out of 10. Episode 4, Sea Maiden. This is the first episode of the season that I actually like. It's the second episode of the show to feature the seahorses, and I can't remember what I said about them in previous videos, but I'm sure I was really nice about it. Surprisingly enough, I don't mind them here. I think the dynamic of Snork Maiden and the seahorses works 1,000 times better than Moomintroll and the seahorses. Their mean girl personalities make so much more sense here and create a much more compelling conflict. Wanting to fit in and be like the cool girls is way more understandable than getting a crush on a horse even though she's a bitch to you and you already have 2 love interests.
It would be nice to have a story to tell our children.
Not really, I'm gay.
Snork Maiden is kind of the MVP of this entire show, and she's one of the only characters that I feel ended the series better than she started it. I also want to shout out Akia Henry, who voices her. She might be giving the best and most consistent performance out of anyone in this entire cast, and if you know me, you know that's saying a lot. She clearly loves the character and the world of the Moomins, and I really appreciate that. I rate Sea Maiden a 6 out of 10. Episode 5, Inspector Stinky. This is by far my favorite of the season. In my opinion, this episode most closely matches the feeling of seasons 1 through 3. It feels the most like the show, if that makes sense. I love Stinky in this adaptation. I think he's so fun, and this episode was the shot in the arm the season needed. I don't have a lot of major complaints about this episode, but it doesn't quite reach the same heights as the show's best, so I rate it a comfortable 7 out of 10. Episode 6, Midsummer Meddling. This episode had such an interesting premise and then failed me miserably. I love the idea of Mrs. Filionk on a grand romantic adventure, and I love the idea of all these random characters in the valley falling in love with each other, but this episode was just so boring. Except for when Stinky and Sniff fell in love. What the fuck? What are we doing here, guys? Is this really the best use of our time? Do you guys remember when The Rise of Skywalker came out and there was a controversial same-sex kiss between 2 unnamed characters in a 2-second scene that was very easily cut from the film? And how the filmmakers could have easily filmed a kiss between 2 different, more central characters who already had romantic tension, especially if it was that easy to remove? I don't know, just thinking about that for no reason. It is unbelievable to me that the only canonically queer characters in this show are Stinky and Sniff. Forget Midsummer Meddling, I'm about to commit a midsummer murder. I love you, Charlie Nelson. Oh my god, is that Phil Cornwell? I rate Midsummer Meddling a 4 out of 10. Episode 7, Moomin Mama the Artist. I know I already said this, but it bears repeating. This season is very boring, and it's not like my attention span is too short to sit through a 20-minute episode of a TV show. I tune into Abbott Elementary every single week. Notice how it's season 4 of that show and Janine and Gregory are now an official couple after building up their relationship throughout the entire show? Interesting. I just feel like this season is wasting so much time considering this is the last time we're going to see these characters in this world. This is the end, the line in the sand, the blue dressing room bell. We're on episode 7 out of 12 and nothing has happened. And this season is so repetitive too. This episode is obviously supposed to be a send-off for Moomin Mama, but once again, Moomin Papa has to make it about him because God forbid we let Moomin Mama have anything. I love Moomin Mama and I'm glad she got one last episode all to herself, but this one also fell short for me. I rate Moomin Mama the artist a 5 out of 10. Episode 8, The Great Cold. I'll be totally honest with you, I started writing this video and drew the thumbnail the day I finished watching the show, all the way back in October. The reason it took me so long to actually finish this video is because I just didn't want to go back and rewatch these episodes, and every time I did, I would have to do it all over again because I kept forgetting what happened. This episode got on my nerves, man. It's the first time in 6 episodes that we see Moomin and Snufkin have any sort of meaningful interaction, and they're just fighting over what to do about these woodies that have taken over Moomin House. And then Snufkin leaves out of nowhere, forcing Moomintroll to figure shit out himself. It's not exactly out of character for Snufkin to leave situations abruptly.
Just remembered. It's minnow season.
But to abandon Moomintroll like that? His bestie? Snufkin, dude, the woodies are like your kids. They listen to you. There is nobody in this entire valley better equipped to deal with them than you. If you'll recall, that was literally the plotline of an episode in season 3, Snufkin in the Fairground, where he and Moomin had a huge argument because Snufkin was trying to avoid responsibility. This episode in particular is what made me finally realize that I just wasn't going to get anything I wanted from this season. The characters I care about are barely present and their relationships aren't at all what they used to be. It's a sad, sad situation. That being said, at this point I'll take what I can get. I rate The Great Cold a 5 out of 10. Episode 9, Moomin Papa the Great Explorer. This is the episode everyone was waiting for, the introduction of Jockster. This is the Jockster episode. Jockster is now here. Huzzah and hurrah, we all love Jockster. I don't love Jockster. I talked about this a little bit in my reaction, but I just never gelled with him as much as everyone else seemed to. Even if I wasn't super hyped to see Jockster and see him reunite with Moomin Papa, I was super hyped to see how the show would introduce Jockster to Snufkin. There's so much potential here for a really interesting father-son dynamic. It was one of the only things left for me to be genuinely excited about. I did like seeing Moomin Papa and son out on another adventure. I like their father-son dynamic. This episode was just okay. I can see how you would like it, but once again, it just didn't work for me. Am I the problem? I might be. I rate Moomin Papa the Great Explorer a 4 out of 10. Episode 10, Song of the Groke. I've been kind of negative these past few episodes, so I'll start by saying something positive. I love Little Mai, I love Snork Maiden, and I love seeing them together. I would have liked to see more of Little Mai this season. I feel like she and Snufkin both got shafted. This season is more about the valley than the actual Moomins, which sounds nice on paper, but in my opinion, the final season of a show should also be focused on tying up loose ends with the more central characters. I think Snork Maiden's character was resolved well enough, like I said, but characters like Snufkin, Snork, and even Moomintroll have so much more story to tell. And the first 3 seasons were building up their characters and paths so well, but season 4 seems to have abandoned almost all of that. I just think it's a little strange that we're getting episodes dedicated to characters like Sniff and the Groke and concluding their storylines, but not the main characters of the show. Again, it feels like so many of these episodes are just a rehash of story beats we've already seen, but they're not developed any further. It makes the rest of the show seem kind of pointless. I rate Song of the Groke a 4 out of 10. Episode 11, Moomin Papa and Aunt Jane. The pacing of this season is strange. This show usually follows the changing of the seasons, and season 4 does too, but in kind of a weird way. Like in episode 6, it was midsummer, but 2 episodes later, it's the dead of winter. I just don't understand anything about the way this season chooses to spend its time. I actually like this episode quite a bit. It might be the best Moomin Papa episode of the show. I like seeing him finally publish his memoirs. He's been working on them for the entire show, and it creates a sense of completion and puts a nice little button on things. I also loved the different animation style at the beginning and end of the episode, and how Moomin Papa's memories of Aunt Jane were reframed by the end. I like Aunt Jane too. This is one of my favorites of the season, but there are aspects of this episode I did not care for and actually kind of pissed me off. First of all, Sniff is back on his bullshit. What the fuck's that about? Like, I kind of thought we were past all that. It feels like the writers wanted to complete his arc this season and make him more mature, but they also feel like they need him as comic relief, so he can't make any long-term change. It's like a Murdoch Nichols situation, but instead of being evil and causing problems, it's being stupid and causing problems. And remember all that stuff I said about Snufkin and Jockster? Yeah, they never meet. They're not even allowed to be in the same frame at the same time. And throughout the episode, Little Mai is trying to get them introduced because she realizes Jockster must be Snufkin's father, but it just doesn't happen. It could have just been like a 5-second scene of them looking at each other, but no. At this point, it feels like the writers are tricking their audience just because they like doing it, and it just feels kind of mean. And you could argue that Snufkin isn't the kind of character who wants or needs a father figure, but this is the final season of the show. We're never going to see him interact with his dad. He doesn't even know Jockster is his dad. I guess there's always the upcoming movie, but I won't hold my breath. This is just one example of a much larger problem, in my opinion. This entire season feels like a lot of setup and no payoff. I rate Moomin Papa and Aunt Jane a 6 out of 10. Episode 12, Comet in Moominvalley. Before I sat down to watch this episode, the Moominvalley series finale, I was genuinely having such a good day. I would never have thought watching Moominvalley would make my day worse. I'll start off positive again. I do think the comet was a good idea for an ending since November was already taken, but I was under the impression that the season would be building up to the comet because the season 3 finale first set it up, but that's not what happened. Like, I hated the Lighthouse episodes in season 2, but at least those were built up in the first half of the season. I also feel like because of the pacing and the way this episode was written, the actual comet wasn't treated as a real threat. The stakes are higher than they've ever been, but it doesn't feel that way at all. I know I said I was going to evaluate the show on its own, but the book Comet in Moominland was an exploration of grief and of loss. It was published the year after World War II ended, for God's sake. Remember Snufkin weeping over the loss of the sea? There were so many things that should have been included but weren't. All the material was there for a great episode and a strong finale, but none of it was used properly in my opinion. And the Groke sacrificing herself to stop the comet makes no goddamn sense. First of all, how would that even work? I get the Groke is cold enough to put out a fire, but this is a big-ass comet. Second of all, she already had her own episode earlier in the season, and like Sniff, I thought her story was pretty much over. Third of all, I know the Groke is constantly seeking light and warmth. She's a metaphor for depression, but how does that translate to her throwing herself at the comet like the Iron Giant? I don't know. This finale was such a letdown. I feel like all of the pieces were there to end the season and the show in a really effective and meaningful way, but none of those pieces were actually put together. I rate Comet in Moominvalley a 4 out of 10. So now that we've gone through every episode of the season, it's time to average our scores together to get our final rating for the season as a whole. And if my math is right, the score comes out to a 4.7 out of 10, which I'll round up to a 5 out of 10. If you've seen my previous reviews, you'll know that I gave the first season an 8, the second season a 6, and the third season another 8, meaning the fourth season is the lowest rated season of the show. Maybe this is just part and parcel of adapting a series like this, but there were so many storylines that were rushed and so many characters that were shafted or mischaracterized, and that's technically true of the entire series, but in my opinion, the other 3 seasons are mostly able to stand alone. But in the fourth season, they backtracked over everything they had built up in the first 3 seasons. This one absolutely does not hold up, and the fact that it's the final season makes it so much worse. It's almost like season 4 exists in a different continuity, where some of the status quo changes and character arcs from seasons 1 through 3 are present and some aren't. Apparently, the theme of the season was supposed to be utopia, and I didn't get that at all. Does utopia mean that nothing interesting happens? And I talked about this a little bit with Snork Maiden, but I don't feel as though the majority of the characters ended the series better or more developed than they started it. And you know what? Let's get into it. Let's talk about Snuffman. I'll admit it, I got queer baited. Moominvalley was clearly hinting at a romantic relationship between Moomin and Snufkin. That's not me being delusional, that's me having eyeballs. This show has a huge audience of queer adults because of this dynamic. But now we know it was all going nowhere, and that's so disappointing. And if you ask me, it's kind of fucked up to use a queer woman's characters to con queer people into watching your show, especially if you're not actually planning to see things through. And maybe some of you are thinking, well, what did you expect to see? And honestly, I don't know. I wasn't expecting a kiss or even a confession. I just wanted some kind of conclusion to finish what the first 3 seasons started. This is, in my opinion, one of the show's biggest faults, and not just because I like Moomin and Snufkin as a couple and wanted to see them end up together. In my opinion, from a writing and show running perspective, not making Snuffman canon makes the show worse, and I would still think that even if I didn't like the ship. If you spend 3 seasons setting up a relationship only to not address it at all in the final season, that's bad writing regardless of what you think of that relationship. I talked about this a lot while recording my reaction video, and a lot of what I said didn't make the final cut, so I'm just gonna put that audio here because I think my points still stand. I love this show, I do, but that is the one thing I wanted from this season, from this show, and it would have been so easy, but they stopped just before the finish line, and now all the work they put into building that relationship meant nothing. I feel like a fool. I was played like a harmonica. I've been baited into thinking there would be queer characters in this show. I wish there was a word for that. After watching season 4, I felt so completely duped that I started wondering if the show just wasn't as good as I remembered it being. So I rewatched season 1, and I absolutely loved it. I also listened to the soundtrack, and the 1-2 punch of Back to the Cave and Love Me With All Your Heart still hits just as hard. I rewatched season 3, and I still thought it was fantastic. I even went back and watched season 2, which I thought I disliked, and I honestly don't even think it's that bad anymore. I miss Drift. Can we go back to Drift? The turnaround I've had with that song is crazy. I kind of like it now, and it's definitely not because I'm at all biased towards this song or its singer in any way. Finally, I rewatched one of my favorite videos on all of YouTube, They in Love by Snufkin's Hat. And you know what? I almost cried. Moominvalley is a good show. I still believe that. But season 4 really dropped the ball, and now I just feel dumb. I feel dumb for getting queer baited. I feel even dumber for getting this invested in a children's show. And I feel dumbest of all for going on my YouTube channel and telling my audience, "No guys, it's not queer baiting, it's queer representation. They wouldn't put all this subtext in the show if they weren't gonna make it canon." But I was wrong, and I feel like a fool. Caliucci's was right. It's no fun to feel like a fool. The team behind this show had the opportunity to do something really special, and they were doing so well for so long, but everything fell apart right before the finish line. So now we just have to wait for the movie, I guess, but I have zero confidence that it'll improve upon the final season in any meaningful way. Worst case, we'll just have to wait for the next adaptation in 10 years only to be let down again, and Moomin Troll will probably be voiced by Kit Connor, and they somehow won't remember that he can sing until the end of the 2nd season. I love this show with all my heart, and that's partially because I know it was made with so much love. This series and the 90s anime are the ultimate comfort shows for me, with their messages of acceptance, appreciation for nature, and simplicity. I think that's what a lot of people need right now. I know I do. Like, I'm American, and the reason I went back to this show is because I just needed that comfort. It's comforting to see this franchise from 80 years ago that is still progressive by today's standards. It's reassuring to see such strong environmentalist messages and queer themes in this work, and to see a world in which everyone is welcome and accepted for who they are. I will always respect the team of talented creators and artists behind this show, but I just didn't feel any of that this season. But if you enjoyed it and you feel represented by the show, then that's amazing. I know a lot of people do, even I do. I'll always go back to the first 3 seasons, and I'll probably review the movie if and when it ever comes out, but I don't see myself rewatching this season ever again. Unless it's for a future video, which is actually pretty likely, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you liked me, be sure to subscribe to my channel. If you want, you can even turn notifications on so you'll be the first to know when I'm hanging out with a pair of hot seahorses who hate me. I also recently released an album, so if you want to listen to my album, I would really appreciate it. Although, technically it's not my album, of course. It's Angel Valentine's. Anyways, that's gonna be all from me. I've gotta go. I just remembered. It's minnow season. Goodbye.